Alright guys, I'm here back with a new video, and in this video, as in tradition of whenever doing these Survivor retrospectives, as I did for the Amazon, I followed it up by doing a player ranking for a season. So here I'll be ranking every player from Survivor to the Amazon based on how I feel like they played on that season. So obviously we have 16 players to rank. Let's get right into it. At 16, the worst player from Survivor the Amazon ends up being Ryan, the first boot of the season. And straight up, a lot of these early boot placements are not going to be that interesting. But Ryan is someone that I think on the show, based on what we saw on the show, he doesn't seem that bad. I mean, yes, the fact that he is this young athletic guy and is still the first boot is something that is very abnormal for Survivor. And on the show, it's portrayed as like he's getting voted out for something that he didn't even do. I mean, they showed it because like him and Dan messed up the challenge when it was pretty much all Dan. Again, from what I understand, the real reason why Ryan had a target on his back from the very beginning was due to a lot of pre-game stuff, to where in Ponderosa, Ryan ended up annoying the likes of Roger to where Roger wanted to target him right away. And that is why he's targeted over Dan. Though also on the island, it did seem like he was looked at as a very obnoxious figure and one that simply just annoyed a lot of the people that are out there, to where the likes of Rob Ciccinino said after the fact that Ryan was a much worse player than what he was displayed as on the show. Now, I will say that I do think he's not the worst player in the world, and the fact that he at least had a solid ally in Dan Liu and also got the likes of Matthew to go out of his way to try to save him as well. Also, he had Dave not wanting to vote him out as well, though to be fair, that is mostly because they had a connection pre-game through coming from the same hometown. So again, it's like on paper, he doesn't have the worst game in the world, but considering the fact that he was still the first boot, and a lot of it seemed to be due to his own actions of him just continuing to put the target further onto himself. For me, he is here at number 16. At number 15 is someone I did debate putting as the worst, mainly because this person had no real shot at anything, but I put him above because again, I feel like they had less unforced errors, and that person is Janet. And really, Janet, I don't think she does that much wrong in the game. I think the issue is, one, she's on the older side of things, so is already perceived as weak, and then also got sick to where she wanted to leave because of that. Like, really, it's like I don't think Janet does much wrong in game. I just feel like she was just always going to be a very early boot, and again, I don't feel like she did that much wrong. Now, obviously, she gets blamed for the granola gate, and I mean, the stories around there are very wonky, but realistically, I think she was going to be the boot before that anyway. I think that was just a good storyline for the show, and I really don't feel like she did that much wrong, but was still an early boot, so I have to put her here at 15. Now, number 14, we're moving on to a player that this and the next player we'll be talking about are kind of tied together, considering they played very similar games. But this is the person that was taken out first out of the duo, and here we're going to start off with Joanna. And Joanna, to me, was actually probably not as bad of a player on the rewatch as I remembered. Like, I always remembered her as an all-time worst player, but in reality, yeah, she did have a confrontation with Christy that was not a good look, and also she had all the religious stuff going on. But really, I think outside of that, she actually had some level of game ability. I mean, she was willing to work with Gene, and they strategized together to try to get Dina in the leadership position to put a target on her. Again, they had some pretty poor social play through them being the hard workers at camp and really trying to make everyone feel bad for not working, and that's pretty bad. But again, I feel like there's a level of strategic gameplay there, but realistically, I do think Joanna is still probably a pretty bad player. Again, seemed to socially ostracize a lot of her tribe and following that up by coming off as a really big physical threat to the point where they wanted to get rid of her. And while I do think there are probably biases that harmed her initial perception in the game, I do think as a whole, she didn't play that well outside of those things. So because of that, for me, she is still here at number 14. Now, number 13, again, person tied to her, I do have Jean. And Jean ends up again playing a very similar game of seeming to have some strategic ability and being tightly aligned to Joanna, but beyond that had some poor play as well. Again, seemed to ostracize the rest of the tribe through being a workaholic, seemed to try to take the leadership role without wanting the actual leadership role, where again we have her delegating Dina as the leader, yet despite that, Jean still tries to tell people what to do. And I think the fact that she gets swapped into a position where she's taken out immediately after that, instead of being looked at as a potential swing vote, where again, like the swap ends up occurring to where Jean was already on the bottom coming into it. So through that, that would normally be a situation where the person on the bottom of their previous tribe ends up becoming a swing after the swap and ends up flipping over. But instead, they want nothing to do with her. Instead, vote her out there instead. And again, to me, it's like, I just don't know what potential there really was with Jean, despite her having a level of strategic ability. So because of that, for me, Jean is here number 13. 13. Now, number 12, moving on to the earliest boot left on the board, we do have Dan Liu. And Dan Liu is a player that I think actually isn't that bad. I mean, he is the second boot from his tribe, seeming to be instantly on the bottom through his relationship with Ryan, but I actually, again, don't feel like he played that poorly. Where, again, outside of his relationship with Ryan, I feel like his actual boot round was a round that he actually played pretty well considering his circumstances, where he does try to form a rebellion against Roger. He does try to get the likes of Rob and Alex, and I believe it was Alex that was the one that didn't want to go through the plan at the time, but he did have a solid plan that he tried to put together, and it seemed like some of the pieces were sticking, but by the end of it, obviously everything doesn't go through, but I do think he plays pretty optimally that round, and also considering the potential biases against him as well, it's like, I feel like Dan Liu is probably a better player than what his placement indicates, though still kind of a doofusy guy and one that further painted a target on himself through his relationship with Ryan. But again, I think the fact that he had such a good bond with Matthew and tried to pull in the votes, I think it's good enough for him to be here at number 12. Number 11, we have a player that I wanted to put lower, but I can't, considering the fact that he did make a somewhat deep run and did seem to have a decent amount of control early on in the game, and that person is Roger. Now, Roger, again, had the initial majority. He's the one that formed this grouping of him, Butch, and Dave, and through that they had Alex and Rob, and later Matthew, alongside them. He did have the initial majority that controlled the Ryan and Dan votes. After a swap, he ends up remaining in the majority, where they pull over Heidi, where again, he's really never in true danger until the merge, but coming into the merge, he obviously has this very glorious downfall there, but really Roger, again, I think the issue is not really the game on paper, where really I think his game on paper isn't terrible. I think it's really just who Roger is, to where he's just so unlikable. Where through his questionable comments about gay marriage and willingness to fight with people over their political beliefs, and then following that up with him clearly being looked at as a misogynistic figure to the point where the women vote him out because they don't want him on the jury, as they know that he would never vote for him. Again, that is really bad. And mixing that with the fact that I think he has literally zero win equity. I cannot imagine a world where Roger is given the win out of any of the people there, even against a Matthew, who is probably the next biggest GOAT on the board. I do think Matthew would still probably beat Roger pretty definitively. He is a pretty poor player, but at the end of the day, again, he technically outplays Dan Liu, so I felt like he needed to be above Dan Liu, and through that just ends up landing here at number 11. Now number 10, moving on to a player, again, the earliest boot left on the board, and here we do have Oshana. And Oshana for me is a very difficult player to rank because I do think Oshana could have been a decent player. I think she could have been a player that at least made a deep run into the season. Again, I don't think her win equity is really particularly high, but she did get lumped into the initial majority alliance. It was the young girls plus Dina. However, she ends up wanting to quit midway through her run, and through that she essentially gets kicked outside of the majority alliance, where after a swap, it seemed like that played a major factor in her eventually getting voted out, that along with her relationship with Alex, and also wanted her to get voted out to add to this story of pretending to Roger that the men were sticking together. And all this is very conflicting to me as a player, because it's yeah, she did cause her own downfall, but a lot of that came from her, again, kind of wanting to quit. Where I think if the game had played out more naturally and she had been in a situation where she didn't want to quit, would that still have happened? Probably not. Though also, who knows how it would have played out. But I do feel like she would have had a deeper run in her, and that's why I do have her at the top of the pre-jurors. But again, I can't put her much higher. There's really not much of an argument to put her above literally anyone else, considering how much she did it to herself still, and because that, for me, she's here at number 10. Now number 9, and again, from this point forward, everyone left is a post-juror, and this is kind of a weird grouping of players, where this is one of these seasons where a lot of the power players go out early in the merge. So again, getting the player ranking sorted here was a bit of a train wreck, but at number 9, we're starting it off with Christy. Now, Christy is a player that obviously has this major disadvantage in the fact that she is deaf, and through that obviously has trouble building social bonds with players who feel like it's harder to communicate with her, and obviously that is a massive disadvantage in all this. However, I think even beyond that, she was playing pretty poorly. Though again, at the end of the day, yeah, you could stem it all back to that. But again, she was pretty abrasive to her tribe, to where they were annoyed with her pretty early on, where there were talks about her being the first boot. But at that point, I think the fact that she was stronger in challenges than Janet was a major factor in why she stayed. You have her then being lumped into the Joanna boot, but again, simply as a number. She's on the outs. during the Jean vote. Had no clue that was going to happen. Probably would have been the next boot if that tribe had ever gone to tribal again. At the merge, she gets voted for by the people that she had been on the swap tribe with, to where she really ends up staying due to really nothing that we saw that she was actively doing. It seemed like it was just due to the mistakes of Roger and also the gameplay of the people that were actually in charge. And following that, she's kind of just on the bottom, kind of just riding by for a bit as the bigger threats take each other out. And even then, along the way, she's on the outs during the Dina vote. She's pulled into the Alex vote, but again, didn't seem too integral in the execution of it. And then is eventually taken out in her boot round through her not committing to either side, to where we see the two sides come together to take out the swing vote. So again, all that is pretty bad. Like, it is a pretty bad game on paper, where again, she had a number of strategic and social missteps along the way. However, again, considering the fact that I do feel like a lot of that is perpetuated by her being depth, and then also she makes a pretty deep run this season, I couldn't put her too low, so she's here at number 9. Now, number 8, moving on to a player that also had a very deep run this season, but also equally had very little agency in the game and also very middling jury chances, and that person is Butch. And Butch is a player that, again, like, made it to 4th place. However, really questionable how he made it to 4th place. Again, early on, I mean, he is in the initial majority alliance with Dave and Roger. They're running the original tribe. Post-swap, he's still with Dave and Roger, and they continue to run that tribe. But again, like, we've seen very little of Butch throughout a lot of this, to where I don't know how much game he was actually playing throughout a lot of that, to where, again, I don't know how integral he was to any of the success of his group. But then we get to the merge, where, again, he's on the outs where Roger is blindsided. He is then looked at as such a non-threat, to where, again, the threats take each other out. The Daves, Dinas, Alex. He's considered the last part of the chain, to where Matthew is the one that's giving him orders, which is just extremely humorous. And again, it didn't seem like he was that integral to the eventual Alex flip. That does greatly benefit his game. The Christy vote, he's completely on the outs for, only for him to be back in the numbers of the Heidi vote. But again, that was seemingly due to the fact that, again, he's just such a non-threat. And at the final 4, at the point that Jenna wins immunity, it's Butch that becomes the target there instead of Rob, which is really mind-blowing there, where Matthew has the choice between Butch and Rob and ends up picking Rob, who he loses against, instead of Butch, the person that he at least has a sliver of a chance of beating. While also is the one that campaigned to Jenna by saying that Butch doesn't deserve to be there, to which Jenna ends up agreeing as well. Again, like, it is a pretty bad downfall there, to where he's even then taken out, not because he's looked at as a threat, but really the complete opposite, because they just didn't want him to win. And really, again, jury vote wise, I don't know who he beats in this endgame. I think the only person he would have a chance against is Matthew, to which, again, he probably beats him, but again, that's more so probably due to anti-Matthew sentiment than a pro-Butch sentiment. But again, even that's not secure. Like, really, I do think Butch overall played a pretty poor game, had really no agency throughout a lot of it. But again, he's higher to me than Christy, because I do feel like he makes less unforced errors in the game, and because of that, he's here number 8. Now, number 7, moving on to the earliest boot left on the board, and really the next few people we will be talking about are these string of big threats that were taken out earlier in the game. And here at number 7, we do have Dave. And I mean, the fact that Dave is number 7 here is not me saying that I think Dave is a good player, because, like, at the end of the day, I think Dave also played pretty mediocrely. However, I really just don't feel like the Amazon cast was that great of a cast in terms of gameplay, where obviously you have one massive outlier, but outside of that, I feel like everyone else is mostly mediocre. And again, Dave being at 7 here is really just because everyone below him is so bad. But again, Dave is someone that seemed to be well positioned early on. He seemed to be the guy that Roger and Butch pulled into their alliance. He seemed to be one of the safer guys on the original Tambaki, though at the same time, he does let go of a potential ally in Ryan along the way. I mean, at the swap, he gets strategic credit on the show for using Jenna's information against her during the tribe pick, but even then, I feel like he made some questionable decisions there, and where he does pick his 2 closest allies in Butch and Roger to go with him, which I don't have much flaw with that, even though the show portrays that as a negative. I more so have a flaw with the fact that he spends his time bonding with Jenna only to then take Heidi from her, only to then not vote out Heidi, which kind of makes you question why take her then. And really, the entire thought process of the vote at Tambaki, where they vote out Jean, is so misguided to me. Again, the fact that they don't pull over Jean to be a number for them just seems so bizarre, where they're keeping in these 2 other women that have more connections on the other side and openly say that we're voting out Jean because that was Jabiru's pecking order, which makes no sense. So you're voting out Jean to help out the other side to do their dirty work? Like, it makes no sense. And again, when we get to the merge, he's just down the numbers by that point, where he is going to be the initial boot. However, then they flip the vote to Roger due to really nothing that Dave did. And eventually Dave's taken out the following round, where I will say he probably makes the best argument he can to stay there and trying to pin the target onto Matthew. But I mean, I don't really feel like there was much he could do. Again, like, it's a very meh game. Like, it's a very average early merge boot style of game. There really isn't much too positive, but not much too negative either. And because then he does land here number 7. Now number 6, we got the next boot on the board. We're talking about Dina. And Dina's a player that I really liked on the rewatch. I do feel like she's a player that is very active in the game, and you could tell that she kind of tried to model some of her game after the likes of a Danielle Reyes, but was just a lot messier in the game to where, I mean, she was playing pretty well for a lot of it. I mean, early on in the game, she has a line with the younger women, ends up becoming their leader, and through that has full control over the original Jabiru tribe after the swap. She ends up doing a really great job realigning, creating a final 2 with Rob that becomes her true alliance moving forward, and through that solidifies that Jabiru group to become the new majority coming to the merge. At the merge, we obviously have her as this figurehead that's leading the Roger vote, and then the Dave vote's a bit wonky where, I mean, the show portrays it as if she wanted to keep Dave around. I don't know how true that actually was, but either way, she's obviously booed the very following round where she decides to target Alex and plays very sloppily during that round. I mean, that is like a pretty poor round of gameplay there, to where really outside that, again, I think she plays the game pretty well. To where, like, coming into Final 8, she was in the majority alliance. Mind you, she was perceived to be on the bottom of the majority alliance. However, Rob was actually loyal to Dina at that point. I do think he would have been willing to flip the game on Alex had she not completely exposed her game by telling the likes of Jenna and Heidi, to where at that point he gets back to Alex. And really from there, her game completely blows up. However, I do feel like there's a path there for Dina to take control of the game. It's just that she played that round so poorly to where she wasn't able to do so. But considering how well she played for a lot of the game, I do still have her pretty high here at number 6. Now number 5, a very similar player to Dina. Here we do obviously have Alex, the following boot, and pretty much same thing, but outplays Dina by the end. I mean, Alex is another player that was very well positioned early on. Mind you, I will say, unlike Dina, he was not in real full control early on, where he was more so in a center position than he was leading the majority tribe, where again we kind of saw the Roger, Dave, Butch trio be kind of the core of the power structure, while Alex was right outside of it. But Alex was also kind of the swing where he was aligned with Rob, and through Rob had connections to Matt and Dan, to where if they wanted to, they could have flipped the vote there, though I think Alex was the one that turned that down. But still very well positioned early on. He then kind of loses some of his game at the swap, where he does get too close to Oshana, and through that there's talk about wanting to take out Oshana to separate them. And he also starts to lose some trust in Rob, to where Rob does make the deal with Dina, to where they become loyal to each other moving forward. And then at the merge, obviously we have Alex flipping against the older men to vote out Roger, and then continues the Pagong voting out Dave. Again, like, up to that point, it's a very similar game to Dina. I would actually say Dina played a better game up to that point. However, I do think it's Dina's boot round that really makes Alex's game shine, to where Alex finally is able to demonstrate some of his good gameplay there, and where his really strong relationships with the likes of Jenna and Heidi end up working for him there, to where when Dina tries to blindside him, they end up bringing this back to Alex, to where they are able to form a counter plan here and blindside Dina instead. Now, I will say that there were probably some red flags along the way here, where he finds out that Rob didn't tell him the plan, to where he goes and confronts Rob and ends up buying what Rob is selling, even though I'm pretty sure Rob was willing to cut Alex at that point in the game. And we see that come to fruition the following round, where, again, despite pulling off the Dina blindside, Alex just gets extremely cocky that he's going to be in the Final 4, to the point where he tells Rob that if I win immunity at Final 4, I'm voting you out, which makes no sense. Like, this entire concept makes no sense. Why is it only if he wins immunity? Like, shouldn't it be the opposite, that if I don't win immunity, then I'm voting you out? Like, in this situation, you're essentially telling him that I'm voting you out no matter what then. Because that's actually a position where he has more leverage to not vote Rob out. But either way, again, asinine move there that does cause his eventual downfall, where he is blindsided in a 4-3 vote. And again, like, a completely unforced error there, really bad there. Though, if he did not make that error, he probably would have been pretty close to a steamroll at that point. I mean, it definitely would have been looking good for him at the final 4, to where you only need 2 immunity challenges to get to the very end. Also in the situation where one of Jenna or Heidi win immunity, it's not out of the realm of possibility to believe that Rob just would have been voted out at that point, to which at that point he would be 1 immunity away from winning the game. So again, there definitely was upside if he didn't make the dumb mistake he did, but he did make that dumb mistake. And also beyond that, while playing a strong game for the season, had some middling gameplay along the way, because he's here number 5. Now number 4, we're jumping forward all the way to a finalist, and here we are moving on to Matthew. And I probably would have voted for Matthew between Matthew and Jenna. While Matthew was someone that did come off as really crazy to his other players, and through that didn't have much respect from most of his other players due to that, I actually feel like he plays the final 7 on pretty well. Now before that, obviously it's still a rocky road. He does start off on the bottom where he does side with Ryan and ends up being in the minority there. He follows that up with being tightly aligned with Dan Liu before Dan Liu goes home, and would have probably been the next boot had that tribe gone the tribal again. At the swap, he is looked at as the initial target, though obviously that target gets switched onto Oshana. Though along the way, he does build a strong relationship with Rob, though Rob is completely playing him at that point. At the merge, again, he does go along with the Roger and Dave votes despite being on the bottom and not recognizing it at that point. At the Dina vote, he was also once again the initial target, though does win immunity, and through that the majority alliance fractures, and even then he's still being played by Rob throughout a lot of it. So again, like all of his game up to that point is pretty bad. But again, I feel like from the final 7 on, he does play pretty well. I mean, we do see him put good work into trying to get Rob to flip. I mean, again, I would put a lot more of the agency into Rob himself, but I do feel like Matthew did all the right things in that situation. He didn't condemn Rob for admitting to lying to him. He accepted his apology and recognized that it was better for his game to work with Rob moving forward. And through that, they pull off the Alex blindside there. They then vote out Christy as the swing vote in the following round, which I will say that's probably a bit more rocky of a move, where, I mean, we'll talk about when we get to Rob, where even then I think it's a questionable move for him. But even beyond that for Matthew, I still think it was dangerous to keep around the likes of Jenna and Heidi together into the final 5. At a final 4, again, I think we get another pretty questionable decision where he does vote out Rob instead of Butch. Though really by that point in the game, he was really in a position where everyone was going to take him to the end. Now, I do think the flaw in all this is the fact that Butch was probably the person that he was the most likely to win against, even though, again, he probably still wasn't winning. So through that, he does obviously minimize his chances of winning the game, though at the end of the day, I think he was winning anyway, probably not. And then we see him at the final 3, like, make a pretty active move in throwing the immunity challenge in a position where obviously he was already guaranteed to make the final 3, and he does it to secure the jury vote of the person that goes out, which is actually kind of funny considering I believe he actually burns Rob's vote through doing this. Now, I don't think Rob was necessarily going to vote for him anyway, but I do know Rob has talked about how he was even more upset in the fact that Matthew threw the challenge, because at that point he saw it as Matthew had a better shot against Rob than he did against Jenna. But again, like, his maneuvering through the end game here, I do think is pretty solid. Again, like, he does pick up the game pretty well, and like we see him actively going to Jenna and making a final 2 with her. We know he had final 2s with Rob and Butch. It's like he positions himself so well in the final 4. The problem is that he had no winning scenario anyway. And again, that is the reason why he is number 4 here. Where again, if I'm on the island and I had to decide on who to vote for between Jenna and Matthew, I would have personally voted for Matthew, as obviously I'm not factoring in these aspects of who has the respect from jury, as at that point I'm a member of the jury. But as a viewer from the outside and assessing players based on how they played on this individual season, I mean, you definitely do have to factor in the fact that he had no winning scenario into the player ranking here, which is why he does end up being below Jenna at number 4. At number 3, we do have the person I just mentioned. We have Jenna. And Jenna is a very tough winner to assess. And I think in many ways you could argue that she should at least be another spot higher on the list. However, I do feel like Jenna has a lot of subpar play, particularly in the back third of her game, that makes me put her a lot lower. And I think that's my biggest issue with Jenna, because like I will say, like, over time, my opinion of Jenna's first like 2/3 of her game has gone up to where, again, I always look at Jenna as one of the worst winners of the show, and I still agree with that sentiment. However, I do feel like her first 2/3 of the game are actually pretty solid, to where again she's in the initial majority of the Jabiru tribe, building an alliance with Heidi and Dina and Oshana, and eventually when Oshana gets kicked out, they pull in Christy, and really they hold the control of that tribe up until the swap. Now, at the swap, she doesn't make the mistake of leaking too much information to Dave, to where Dave uses it against her in the picking of the tribes, but actually it works out to her favor, where through that specific tribe swap, she does build a stronger bond with Dina. She also builds these relationships with Alex and Rob that push her further into the game. And then we get to the merge, where obviously that group ends up sticking together to take out Roger and Dave back to back. And then we get to the Dina round, where I think things start to unravel a bit, where here we do see Dina obviously decide to flip against Alex, and through that tell Heidi and later Jenna that she wants to take out Alex. And the way that Jenna reacts to this, I think, is really bizarre. I mean, the fact that she takes this so personally, and really, I guess that's really Jenna as a whole, to where it feels like she has a massive disconnect between the game and personal and isn't able to reconcile the two, really just saying that she's an emotional player. And here it does seem like she becomes extremely vindictive against Dina in this position to where she does want to take out Dina, which, I mean, realistically, like, it doesn't really matter that much. I mean, Alex and Dina were probably around the same level of threat. It didn't really matter which one stayed, which one goed, considering she had a connection to both of them. But again, the fact that she takes it so personally here, I think, is definitely something to call out. And we follow this up with the eventual Alex blindside, where she's completely on the outs there after acting extremely cocky around camp. And then we get to the final 6 round, where again, I think she plays this round terribly, despite the fact that she stays. She has Rob approach her for a final 2, and instead of accepting that, because at that point, Rob was genuine that he did want to go to final 2 with her, she instead goes and exposes him to the entire tribe and gets into a confrontation from the entire tribe, which I think is just a terrible look for her there. Also, we do have her winning immunity only to give it up to Heidi, which I get the sentiment of, yes, she wants to give up immunity to Heidi, as Heidi is more likely to be voted out there than Jenna, and through that incentivizes Rob to go through with the plan to vote out Christy, which again was perpetuated by the fact that Christy played poorly, not really by anything Jenna did, and really also at that point, Jenna and Heidi had failed to pull over Christy, as Christy did end up voting out Jenna in that position. But again, there was definitely still a chance that Rob and Matt could have voted out Jenna in that position, to which that would have been an all-time worst move. Though, to be fair, I think a lot of that stems from the fact that I don't think Jenna cared anymore at that point. I think after the Alex blindside, I think she was so personally hurt, and also mixing in the fact that she got sick, that I don't think she really cared at all about the game throughout the final 5 and final 6 rounds, or even in the final 5 round. She's really sick and seems to be willing to quit the game and wants her to be voted out over Heidi. Even at the final 4 round, she seems resolute in the fact that she's about to be voted out until the point that she wins immunity. And even through that, she decides to vote out Rob instead of Butch, which was not an optimal move, but also one that didn't really matter too much. But again, like, she votes out Rob, someone that has higher win equity, over Butch, and also someone that is more likely to win a challenge than Butch. So again, I did feel like that was poor play. And we get to the final 3, where she wins immunity again, but there she makes the right decision voting out Rob. In that final tribal, she shows some unawareness of her game through her constant talk about how she played morally. And while Matt gets a lot more of the brunt of the hostility from the jury for these comments, Jenna has these comments too. And I really feel like Jenna does not play particularly well in the back third of her game. I think really from the Dina vote on, I do think Jenna is playing pretty terribly. Though ends up obviously winning largely due to immunity challenges and then also the good favor she had from the first 2/3 of the game. And obviously she's against someone like a Matthew who really has no shot at winning the game. Now, if she were at the end against Rob, which again would not have ever happened, I do think more than likely Rob pulls it out, though it is an extremely close vote. And really in the scenario that she actually wanted, which was her against Heidi, I don't know who really wins that scenario. I do think it is probably a relatively close vote. Sorry, I do think Jenna probably has the votes of like an Alex and a Dina more than likely, while like Heidi maybe has like a Dave. And really, I think it comes down to how true Rob was about thinking of Heidi as a big threat. But again, like the fact that she's not even like winning in the scenario that she was actively striving for and really just lucks her way into a winning scenario. Again, it's just all a pretty mediocre game in my eyes, despite having a solid first 2/3, but because that for me, she's here at number 3. Now, number 2, I just mentioned this person, and this might be a bit of a surprise for some people, and at number 2 I do have Heidi. And really, like, Heidi and Jenna obviously played a very similar game. They were working in lockstep the entire time. However, based on what we've heard from people out there, Heidi was the bigger threat. Heidi was the person perceived as the better player of the two, and we do see that on the show that Heidi is a much more active strategic player. We do see early on that Heidi is the one that seems more integral in the creation of that majority alliance of her, Jenna, Dina, and Oshana. We also see her getting pulled over to Tamaki 2.0, where again, despite being in a position where Heidi clearly should have been targeted there, she ends up instead becoming the swing vote, where they want to work with her moving forward. At the merge, we obviously see her becoming part of the majority alliance, despite the fact that she was on the opposite tribe as that majority alliance, where really the majority alliance ends up being most of the Jabaro 2.0 tribe, yet they still end up including Heidi in it due to her strong relationships with the likes of Jenna and Dina. Following that, she builds a strong relationship with Dave in the round that he eventually goes home, which I think more than likely would have led to him giving her his jury vote by the end of it if she was at the end. We do obviously see her being integral in getting the vote flipped on Dina, where we see Dina tell Heidi about this plan to take out Alex, and Heidi is the one to tell Jenna, who tells Alex about this plan and ends up flipping the vote on her. And then we get to the Alex vote where, again, same like Jenna, played poorly, came off as way too cocky, has the game flipped on her, and just like Jenna, also the following round gets extremely emotional, though I will say doesn't play as poorly as Jenna in that round, where despite being emotional over the flip, we don't see her really lashing out at Rob like we do see with Jenna. And through that, we also see Jenna give her the immunity necklace, and following that, in the final round, we do see her have this cutthroat nature of when Jenna is sick, she is still willing to campaign against Jenna. And while she's unsuccessful, I do think it shows this cutthroat nature from Heidi that, to be fair, is also part of her downsides. Where, again, like her downside is the fact of threat management, the fact that she was looked at as a bigger threat than Jenna, despite the fact that Jenna was probably the bigger threat in the grand scheme of things, considering Jenna was more likely to win challenges. But I do think it is this game ability that does give Heidi one more agency in her game, but also more likelihood to win a jury vote, where yes, Jenna did have some really strong personal connections to the likes of Alex and Dina, to where maybe they would have voted for her at the end just due to that, but I do think the likes of Rob, Butch, and Matthew had more respect for the way that Heidi played the game, which, as we see, as they explain their vote to vote out Heidi instead of Jenna. And with the vote of Dave as well, that would be enough to get the win alone. Though realistically, again, I still think the Jenna-Heidi situation is still pretty close. But even beyond that, I do think she beats both the likes of Butch and Matthew, and really was just a better player than the show portrays. To where, again, she's not an elite player in the grand scheme of things. She is still a very cocky individual. She's still one that got way too comfortable in the game and let other people show it. But again, in comparison to the rest of this cast, I really don't think this is a good cast from a gameplay perspective. And I think when it comes to Jenna, I think she, again, was a more active player and was looked at as a better player while out there. And I feel like there are less holes in Heidi's game than Jenna's, though obviously Jenna ends up surviving to the final four due to very little that she actively did and then wins out at the end, which obviously makes Jenna look like a better player. But I think in the grand scheme of things, I do think Heidi might be the better player there because Heidi's here number 2. Now, number 1, I mean, was there ever a question? It is Rob Cesternino. However, I will say I don't look at Rob's game as highly as most people. Now, it is a very influential game. It is a game that first demonstrates his ability to flip back and forth within alliances. But again, I don't feel like it's as strong of a game as people talk about. Now, he does start off the game kind of in the middle, where he essentially has these two sides, and the Ryan, Dan, and Matthew side, and then also the Roger, Butch, and Dave side that are kind of fighting for his votes, though realistically it's like also Alex was in the middle, and I think Alex was more solidly with the Roger side. Rob have that much agency there? Not really. But again, he plays it up as if he does. And even then, I do think him voting out Ryan was probably the better move for him at that point in the game anyway, considering how easy it was to later flip the game onto Roger down the road. And we still haven't played in the middle after that, though I will say I think he plays pretty sloppily, to where he does decide to try to target Roger and pull together the votes of Dan, Matthew, and Alex. However, we do see Matthew talking to Dave and telling Dave that Rob is doing this, to where I think this definitely could have backfired on Rob, especially in a more modern season where Rob would have been taken out at this point in the game due to how sloppily he was playing, though obviously it doesn't come to be and Dan gets voted out there instead. Though I do think the next vote would have been a very interesting one, where while I do think Matthew would have been more than likely the next boot, I do think there would have been a chance for it to be Rob as well, though Rob would have been the other possibility. And considering the ammunition that Matthew had against Rob, if Matthew was a competent player, which again, questionable, I do think there was a chance that Rob could have been taken out there. I will say after a swap, I do think his game really starts to pop. Again, the way that he really solidifies the Jabaru 2.0 to where they become the majority after a swap, and also creates this new final 2 with Dina to where they both seem to be fully loyal to each other at that point in the game. I think that is impressive. Also, his move to get rid of Oshana is one that is beneficial to him, as at that point it separates Oshana and Alex and also gets Alex more to his side at that point. At the merge, obviously we have the Roger vote, which take or leave it. I mean, I think Dave would have been the better target for him in that position, though obviously this was more the women wanting Roger out, and I think at this point in the game, to keep this alliance together for a bit longer, I think it probably was better for him to just go along with it. So obviously the following round is kind of monotonous as just the following Dave vote. At the Dina vote, I think we get a lot of intrigue, as this is where we start to see that Rob is really playing a lot of people here, where we do see him really playing Matthew and getting Matthew to pull in Butch and like pretending like there's this later flip against Dina, and we have Rob going back to his alliance and mocking them to them, which again I think is also still sloppy play, to where I think how openly he is playing Matthew in this situation just gives everyone else ammunition to use against him moving forward, which obviously they never do. But again, I think in a modern game, this would not be a successful strategy. But this is where obviously Dina decides to try to flip the game on Alex, to which again, I do think Rob would have been on board with this plan had this plan been conducted differently. I do think Rob was fully loyal to Dina at this point in the game, as he does say after the fact, but also on the show, he does talk about a final 3 with Dina and Jenna, and I do think that was his genuine plan at this point in the game. However, again, by the way that Dina ends up trying to campaign against Alex, it really just exposes him, as again, he didn't tell Alex about this plan, but also, considering he's already been working on Matt and Butch and pretending like the plan is to vote out Dina, by him not voting out Dina at that point, it will make him look very sketchy. And while, like, at the end of the day, yes, he did have the social capital to save Dina in that position, it would have been a lot of social capital to be using in that position, to where, I mean, we do see him essentially use that social capital in the following round, but I think to do all that just to save Dina in a position where Rob himself wasn't in danger, I do think it would have been a lot to ask. So while it would have obviously been ideal for Dina to stay in the game for his game, it really wasn't worth what it would take to get that to occur. Then we get to the final 7, where again, I think at that point he kind of drops the ball early on, again being lumped in with Alex, Heidi, and Jenna as being these really cocky individuals, and seeming to think that they have the final 4 in lock, though that is when we obviously see Rob starting to have some hesitancy with that alliance, and obviously I think that really seals it up is Alex telling Rob that he would vote him out at 4, which is asinine on Alex's end. But through that, we do see Rob again do something that players typically don't do at this point in Survivor, in flipping the entire game once they recognize they're on the bottom. We had just come from a season like Survivor Thailand where there were so many opportunities in order to pull off a move like this, but no one ever does it. And even before that, even on Marquesas, at the time that happens against the Road to 4, that was a situation where many of the other players there had no real options, as they would have been one of the next few boots. And one of the players in the Rob position in that season, Pascal, really didn't even want to do the move. So again, it is really a game changer here in seeing Rob actively pull together the outsiders and flip the vote onto Alex. And what is a very impressive move there, though obviously loses his relationships with Jenna and Heidi, where they're very upset at him the following round. And that's where we get to the very questionable move in my eyes, where I have always been conflicted on the Christy move. Where the Christy move to me is like something that's good on paper. Like when you think about it, again, when you're not sure if you have the majority, and there is someone in the middle that is an easy boot for both sides, obviously see Rob execute this plan of getting these two sides together to take out the swing vote. Like that is a pretty impressive strategic thought. However, I think it's a thought that's rarely the correct move. I think it is a good thought to execute the first half of. I think it's a good thought to approach the other side and talk about taking out the swing vote to stir the votes off of yourself. However, I think it's very rarely the correct move to actually go through with that plan. I think it's a good backup to try to trick the other side into not voting for you, but it's never really the correct move in terms of navigating further into the game. And we do see this end up costing Rob, where through him voting out Christy here, this makes it so that he has to vote out Heidi at 5, to which Jenna ends up winning out at the final 4 and final 3. To where if Rob does vote out Jenna in this position, or Heidi if Jenna doesn't give away immunity at this position, Rob more than likely wins the game. Now, obviously, this is a lot of revisionist history. However, I just feel like in practicality, voting out the swing vote is very rarely the correct move and ends up just being a safe move. To which, again, it ends up being a move that does get Rob to the following round. However, I think another thing to factor in here is the fact that this was a move made at 6, to where I think that also kind of lessens the appeal of the move, to where I think if this was a move at a odd number, to where Rob more than likely would have gone home had he not voted for Christy, I think it would make this move better. However, we're at the final 6 in a position where Rob has 3 locked in numbers. So at worst, he's going to a rock draw, to which he would be safe because they would be voting for him. To which, like, do you really think Butch and Matthew are going to flip against Rob in this position? I don't think so. So again, like, I really just do not agree with this move, despite it seeming like a good move on paper. But again, it does allow him to maintain control for the following round, where he still has the numbers to take out Heidi, though obviously that was the last opportunity to get rid of Jenna before she ends up winning out moving forward. But even then, like at the final 4, he's impressively able to get Matthew to vote out Butch instead of him. Though at the final 3, obviously Matthew throws the final immunity challenge, to where Rob has to win it himself, and he doesn't and gets voted out. Now, Rob was in a good position to win the game at that point. I do think if Matthew not throw the final immunity challenge, or if Rob had one final immunity and taken Matthew, I do think Rob wins the game. I think Rob handily beats Matthew, and I do think Matthew more than likely still would have taken Rob if he was given the choice. Even against Jenna, I do think Rob more than likely wins. Again, it is a very close vote, though. but I do think Rob gets the votes of Matthew, Butch, Christy, and Dina, which would have been enough to win in that position. And really even beyond that, I feel like Rob beats almost everyone in the endgame, especially after the Alex boot, to where despite him coming off as a snake and pissing off the likes of Jenna and Heidi, I do feel like he has the votes to beat literally everyone there, with maybe the exception of Christy. Though obviously I'm not 100% sure on where exactly Christy's winning chances were. So again, Rob plays a game that I think early on he played very sloppily, but then does very impressive work after the swap. Early merge, I feel like he does good work, though again has some sloppy gameplay here and there. But from the Alex vote on, I do think he plays very well, a very innovative game, even though I do question on whether or not taking out Christy was the correct move, even within context of where he was at the game at that point, as I think in retrospect it clearly wasn't the right move. But again, it is a very strong game. One of the strongest games played in early Survivor. However, again, I think it is a game that is a bit overstated in the modern day, though again, in comparison to everyone else on Survivor to Amazon, it is leaps and bounds better than them. So because that for me, it is here number 1. But there we go. That is my player ranking for Survivor the Amazon. Now moving forward, obviously I will be continuing on with this trend. So next up's Pearl Islands at the end of the year with both a retrospective and a player ranking. So stay tuned for that. But for now, that's the video. Thank you for watching.